Hello, this is my presentation for the administration of the Ottoman government in the 15th and 16th centuries. At the end of the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire stood at its greatest territorial extent. Under the reign of Suleiman I the Magnificent, the Ottomans controlled vast swaths of Eastern Europe and the Levant. From Hungary to Egypt, from Algiers to Georgia, the Ottoman state was the largest in the Mediterranean since the reign of Justinian some 1,000 years before. Despite the myriad of cultures, customs, languages, and religions found throughout the empire, uh, they managed these diverse populations with remarkable success. At a time when the states of Western and Central Europe wrestled with questions of religious conformity brought on by the Protestant Reformation, the Ottomans had no such issue. And of course, that brings us to the principal question. How did the Ottoman Empire manage such a large, diverse, heterogeneous empire? Before we delve into the question in hand, it would be important to set some caveats. Firstly, the time frame for this analysis is set between the reigns of Mehmet II and Suleiman I. While many of these ideas predate and exceed past the time frame in question, they were developed and institutionalized during this period. And the second is of regional focus. This class, of course, is based on early modern Europe, and the Ottoman Empire is no exception to this. Um, and while there are many examples of the Ottoman administration and their Egyptian, Arab, or Levantine holdings, the European territories will be our focus. And the reason for this focus is a simple one: to get an understanding of how the common Greek, Serb, Croat, or any other European peoples navigated their government in Constantinople. To best understand the idea of how the Ottoman state administered its vast empire, it would be prudent to have an understanding of how the Ottomans viewed empire and the purpose of the state. The Ottoman concept of this is based on older Persian ideas of statecraft popularized during the Abbasid Caliphate from the 8th to the 13th centuries. And this pan-Islamic model is based on the state deriving its the state of being justice being derived from the state's ability to meet its quotas in governance and military strength. And in short summary, the state should organize the wealth of the Sultan, to defend this wealth, to promote justice, and to promote Islam while permitting other religions to be practiced within its borders. Under this system, there were only two true divisions of the Ottoman Empire: that of the subject peoples, known as the Reyes, and that of the ruling class. What can be taken away from this is that the Ottoman state's primary focus on a macro level is on the administration and security of the empire. Uh, and local issues, as we shall see later, were largely left to local governments. Of course, Islamic law was not the only influential factor. They adopted the Byzantine system of provincial administration and used a kind of pragmatism that balanced the needs of the various religious groups within the empire. One of the ways the Ottoman Empire kept fresh recruits into the ranks of the government is through the devshirme system. The devshirme was a levy that saw the enslavement of Christian boys from across the empire uh, to be trained either as janissaries, the elite fighting corps of the Ottoman Empire, or as scribes who performed a variety of essential functions throughout the government. There were several exceptions of who could be administered in this system. Children from cities were exempted. Of course, it was not uncommon for parents to have their children sent to the countryside or even to bribe officials to have them recruited. It seems clear that being a slave to the Sultan could afford a better quality of life than life as a reyes. Other communities also received exemptions, including those who performed special tasks for the Sultan, such as personal gardeners or gold miners. Children were taken either to Constantinople or Bursa, converted to Islam, and received training to determine their aptitude. Those who completed their training were full members of the Ottoman ruling class. And the devshirme system created one of the great advantages of the Ottoman state: a highly trained bureaucratic and military corps that was personally loyal to the Sultan. Admission into the Ottoman government was based on simple terms that could be theoretically met by anybody who wanted to serve. This meant adherence to Sunni Islam, loyalty to the Sultan and the royal family, and practicing the customs and languages of the Ottoman court. This allowed for a shocking amount of social mobility within the court. Those who performed well and had ambition could climb to the highest ranks of the Ottoman government, including viziers, provincial governors, and guards of the imperial harem. And the opposite was also true. Continued failure could see members demoted to the level of the reyes and removed from the ruling class entirely. It should be noted that this demand for excellence was required of every man entering service of the Sultan, and inheritance of a title provided no protection. The Austrian ambassador to the Turkish court, Ogier Ghislain de Busbecq, marveled at the Ottoman system, remarking, quote, "Each man in Turkey carries in his own hand his ancestry and his position in life, which he may make or mar at his will." The Ottoman Empire was also uncanny in its ability to bring newly conquered territories into friendly terms. This approach was twofold. Firstly was the integration of the local elite into the Ottoman government. And this method was surprisingly straightforward. Those who swore allegiance to the Sultan were allowed for them to keep their property and, for the most part, positions of power. This allowed smaller communities to be brought quickly into the Ottoman system. And this accommodation extended to how determining tax burdens as well. Ottoman scribes would document the procedures and methods of production of a particular province and determine from there what the tax burden should be. This level of accommodation allowed the Ottoman state to find friends in new subjects. The second came from the tolerance of heathen religions. Religious tolerance was something new to the Ottoman world. Christians and Jews were considered dhimmi, or people of the book, and were afforded protections in exchange for a special tax called the jizya. Where the Ottoman state conducted themselves differently was in the creation of the millet system. Millets, or confessions of faith, were recognized religious communities that worked within the Ottoman Empire. It is important to recognize that religious tolerance in the Ottoman Empire is a far cry from the modern understanding of the word. Non-Muslims had a number of restrictions that applied to public life. This included the fabric of clothing used, the color and turbans permitted to be worn, and forbade the construction of new places of worship. The Egyptian scholar Shaykh Hassan al-Fakwari opined in the 18th century on one of the more peculiar restrictions. Quote, "Dhimmi should not be permitted to use mounts like the Muslims. They must neither use saddles nor iron stirrups in order to be distinguished from the true believers. They must under no circumstances ride horses for the noble character of this animal." End quote. Regardless, the millet system allowed the Ottoman state to supervise the varying legal and religious functions of those communities inside of its borders. The Greek Orthodox millet is a compelling example of how the system functioned. Questions of inheritance, family law, contracts, and others were left to the responsibility of the millet. Patriarchs of the church were responsible for the collection of taxes in their millet and had total control over ecclesiastical matters. Ironically enough, the Patriarch of Constantinople had greater authority and autonomy under the Ottoman Empire than under Byzantine rule. And the Jewish millet had a more complex relationship. Unlike the Christian, Catholic, Orthodox, or Coptic millets, the Jewish community had more than one millet that represented them. These were separated into the Romaniotes, Jews who had lived inside of the Ottoman Empire, or lived inside of the Byzantine Empire before its annexation, or had moved there shortly after. The other group was comprised chiefly of Sephardic Jews, who had sought refuge in the Ottoman Empire after the Kingdom of Spain issued the Alhambra Decree in 1492. The Jewish millets varied greatly in language and culture, so bringing them under a single millet proved impossible. But like what was seen with the Orthodox millet, it allowed for the cooperation of the Jewish community by leaving local and religious issues to those who were closest to the problem. It should also be noted that the millets also worked under the supervision of the Sultan, and leaders could face significant punishments. In 1821, Patriarch Gregory V was executed by the Ottoman government after it determined that he did not adequately suppress a rebellion along the Danube. So, what sense is to be made of the Ottoman form of administration? Based upon what has been discussed here, there are some key takeaways. Most importantly, is the Ottoman system was supremely adaptable. The millet system showed how a generally autocratic system of the Sultanate leveraged its religiously diverse populations. Because local affairs were left to the communities facing them, there would at least be a sense of ambivalence to the government in Constantinople. The Ottoman bureaucracy found much more value in courting the ambitions of talented individuals than uh, satisfying the Turkish nobility in a way that was unlike much of the rest of Europe. And even the Devshirme system, which in many ways created a slave staffed administration, uh, at this point in the empire's history, it was one of its greatest assets. So we arrive again at the question of how the Ottomans managed their large, diverse empire. And what is to be clear is that the sultans bent the rules of statecraft to manage an empire on three continents. Thank you.